The room smelled of diesel fuel and cold concrete, somewhere in a converted schoolhouse outside Ramadi, in the winter of 2006. The prisoner had not slept in 3 days, not because anyone had kept him awake, because he refused to close his eyes. When the interrogator finally asked him why, the answer surprised even the veterans in the room. He said he was not afraid of dying. He was afraid of not hearing them come. Them, not soldiers, not the army. Them, the ones his commanders had started calling the ghosts, the ones who moved through walls, who killed a man in his sleep and vanished into the dark before the blood had time to cool. For nearly 2 years, insurgent networks across Anbar Province had been hunted, cornered and quietly dismantled by an enemy most of their own fighters never saw and could not name. And now, sitting handcuffed in a plastic chair under a bare fluorescent light, one of the last surviving members of that network was about to describe them in detail, for the first time. What this man said in the hours that followed was never meant for public release. Fragments of it would surface years later, buried inside declassified after-action summaries, inside memoirs written by the interrogators themselves, inside academic studies of insurgent psychology commissioned long after the war had moved on to other headlines. But taken together, his words formed something rare, an honest account, from the losing side, of exactly why the United States Navy SEALs became the single most feared instrument of American power in the War on Terror. Feared not because of their numbers, because there were never many of them in any single province, at any given time. Feared for something else entirely, something this man was about to put into words that the intelligence community had been circling for years without ever quite capturing. Before we go further into what he said, it is worth pausing on why this story matters right now. Most of what the public understands about American special operations comes from movies, from recruiting footage, from carefully managed press releases. The real picture, the one visible only from the perspective of the men who were hunted, has almost never been told in full. This channel, Blue Force, exists to tell exactly these stories, the ones that sit behind the headlines and the Hollywood version of events. If accounts like this one interest you, subscribing costs nothing and it helps this kind of research keep reaching people who actually want the full picture, not the sanitized one. Now back to that schoolhouse outside Ramadi, and the man who was about to talk. To understand why his testimony carried the weight it did, you first have to understand the world he came from. By late 2003, the insurgency taking shape in Anbar Province was not a single organization. It was a loose, violent constellation of former regime loyalists, local tribal fighters, and foreign volunteers, drawn in by the propaganda of a Jordanian militant named Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who would go on to found what became known as Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Zarqawi's network specialized in exactly the kind of brutality that dominated Western news coverage: car bombings in crowded markets, public executions filmed for propaganda, ambushes on convoys captured in shaky handheld video. What rarely made it into that coverage was the quieter war being fought against that network from the inside. A war built on patience, on intelligence fusion, and on small teams willing to knock on the wrong door at 3 in the morning. The prisoner in that schoolhouse, whom interrogators listed in their files only as detainee number 7823, went by the name Abu Yusuf among his own men. He was 26 years old when he was captured, a former engineering student from a provincial city who had drifted toward the insurgency after a cousin was killed in an American raid he considered indiscriminate. Abu Yusuf was not a senior commander. He was something more valuable to historians trying to reconstruct this period. A mid-level courier and logistics coordinator who had spent 3 years moving between safe houses, arranging weapons transfers, and increasingly listening to the fears spreading through his own ranks about an enemy his network could not seem to predict, could not seem to see coming, and could not seem to stop. His first direct encounter with that enemy came in the autumn of 2005, though at the time he did not fully understand what he had witnessed. He described a safe house on the outskirts of Fallujah, a squat concrete building his cell used to store weapons and shelter fighters moving between operations. It was, by his account, secure, guarded around the clock, known only to a handful of trusted men. At approximately 0200 hours on a night he remembered specifically because of the absence of wind, that certainty collapsed in under 90 seconds. There was no warning shout, no vehicle engine, no radio chatter picked up beforehand. The first indication anything was wrong, Abu Yusuf said, was the sound of the front door coming off its frame, not broken down loudly the way it happened in films, but removed with a controlled, almost surgical force that left the hinges intact. Then came the flash and the concussion, a device that did not kill but disoriented completely, followed by voices speaking low, controlled English inside a house where English had never been spoken. 2 of his men were captured without a shot fired. A third, who reached for a weapon in the confusion, was neutralized before he could raise it above his waist. Abu Yusuf escaped only because he had been sleeping in a separate structure across a courtyard, and even then he said he heard the entire operation conclude. Men zip-tied, evidence bagged, doors resealed as if untouched, in roughly 4 minutes from first breach to final vehicle departure. What stayed with him was not the violence, Violence was the baseline condition of his entire adult life by that point. What stayed with him was the silence afterward. No follow-up strike. No airstrike leveling the block in retaliation. The kind of blunt response his network had trained its fighters to expect and, in a strange way, to use for propaganda. Just an empty house, 2 missing men who would never be heard from again, through any of the usual insurgent channels, and a growing, unspoken understanding among the survivors that whoever had done this had known exactly which building to hit, exactly how many men were inside, and exactly how long they had before local reinforcements might arrive. That pattern repeated itself with unsettling consistency over the following year, and it forms the second thread of this story, because Abu Yusuf's account was never only about a single raid, it was about an accumulation, a slow psychological erosion that he described more vividly than almost anything else in his interrogation. He recalled a senior commander in his network, a man he refused to name even months into captivity, calling an emergency meeting after a second safe house was compromised in similar fashion. That commander, according to Abu Yusuf, made a statement that circulated afterward among the surviving fighters almost like a warning passed hand to hand. He said the Americans they should fear were not the ones who announced themselves with tanks and loudspeakers. They were the ones who never announced themselves at all. To understand why these operations succeeded with such unnerving precision, it helps to step back from the individual raids and examine the machinery behind them, because this is where the popular image of the Navy SEAL, the lone gunfighter kicking down doors, diverges sharply from operational reality. By the middle years of the Iraq War, American Special Operations Command had built something unprecedented, a fusion of signals intelligence, human intelligence, drone surveillance, and direct action units operating on compressed timelines that sometimes ran from initial tip to executed raid in under 24 hours. This model, often described afterward as find, fix, finish, exploit, and analyze, meant that a single captured cell phone or a single detained courier could generate the intelligence for the next night's target before sunrise. The operators themselves, drawn from the Naval Special Warfare Development Group and allied units, were only the final visible link in a chain that stretched back through analysts, translators, and technicians most of the public would never hear about. This is also where the comparison to conventional forces becomes instructive, because it clarifies exactly what made these small teams so uniquely destabilizing to networks like Abu Yusuf's. A conventional infantry unit clearing a neighborhood announced its presence for miles. Vehicles, radios, dust, noise, and its very predictability gave insurgent networks time to disperse, to hide weapons, to melt into the civilian population before contact was made. A Navy SEAL element, moving on foot in small numbers, arriving by helicopter that cut engines and glided the final approach, or infiltrating on foot from a standoff distance under cover of darkness, offered no such warning. Where a conventional clearing operation might net a handful of low-value detainees who had time to prepare a cover story, a direct action raid built on real-time intelligence tended to capture exactly the right person, exactly when he was least prepared, holding exactly the evidence that would compromise the next node in the network. It was not simply that these men were skilled fighters, though they were among the most highly trained soldiers on Earth. It was that they represented the sharp end of an intelligence apparatus that had turned the insurgency's own communications and movement patterns into a weapon against it. The third episode Abu Yusuf described, the one interrogators would later flag as the turning point in his own psychological account of the war, took place in the spring of 2006, and it was the operation that finally cost his network its ability to operate freely inside Ramadi. He had been tasked with escorting a senior bomb maker, a man responsible for constructing the improvised explosive devices that had killed dozens of American and Iraqi soldiers over the preceding 18 months, to a rural compound believed to be beyond the reach of coalition forces. The compound sat nearly 40 kilometers from the nearest American outpost, reachable only by a single unpaved road that Abu Yusuf's network monitored constantly for any sign of surveillance. They believed they were safe. They were wrong. Within 4 hours of arrival, Abu Yusuf recalled waking to the low mechanical thrum of rotor blades that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a sound he later learned was the product of specially modified helicopters engineered to reduce their acoustic signature during infiltration. By the time the first team breached the compound's outer wall, the bomb maker had barely reached the doorway of the room where he slept. Abu Yusuf, positioned as an outer perimeter lookout roughly 80 meters from the main structure, watched the entire assault unfold through a gap in a mud brick wall. And it was this vantage point, close enough to witness everything, far enough to survive it, that gave his later testimony its unusual clarity. He described operators moving through the compound not in a straight line, but in an interlocking pattern he compared to water finding every gap in a dam, each man covering a sector before the next man crossed his line of fire. Communication reduced to hand signals and single-clipped words. The bomb maker was captured alive, restrained and extracted within roughly 6 minutes, along with 2 laptops, several notebooks and a cache of detonator components that would later be used to trace and dismantle 3 additional cells across the province. Two of Abu Yusuf's fellow guards did not survive the encounter. He himself fled on foot through a dry riverbed and did not stop moving for nearly 11 hours, and it was during that flight, exhausted, alone, replaying the raid in his mind, that he said he first began to understand something his commanders had refused to accept, that the network he had dedicated 3 years of his life to was being taken apart not by luck and not by overwhelming force, but by a level of preparation and restraint his own side simply could not match. His own capture came 4 months later, and it happened, fittingly, without a single shot fired. A joint task force had been tracking financial transfers linked to his logistics network for weeks, narrowing the search until a single vehicle, a single license plate, a single predictable Thursday evening route to a mosque on the outskirts of the city gave them the window they needed. Abu Yusuf described being lifted from the street itself, a hand closing over his shoulder from behind before he had registered anyone was near him, a voice telling him in accented but clear Arabic to remain calm, that no harm would come to him if he cooperated. He said the operation took less time than it would have taken him to order a meal at a roadside stand. There was no beating in the vehicle that transported him. No shouting. Just a professional, almost bureaucratic efficiency that he found, in his own words, more frightening than open violence would have been. The confession itself, the part of this account that would eventually reshape how analysts understood insurgent psychology in Anbar Province, did not come through coercion. It came through weeks of patient, rapport-based interrogation conducted by a small team trained specifically in non-coercive methods, the kind of approach later formalized and studied by military psychologists precisely because it produced more reliable intelligence than force ever had. Over repeated sessions, Abu Yusuf gradually shifted from hostile silence to something closer to reflection, and it was in one of the final recorded sessions that he offered the statement that interrogators would later cite as the clearest articulation they had ever received, from inside the insurgency itself, of what the Navy SEALs had actually accomplished in that province. He said that his network had built its entire strategy around the assumption that fear moved in one direction, from the occupier down onto the population, and that the resistance existed to reverse that direction, to make the Americans afraid instead. What his network had never planned for, he said, was an enemy who refused to be afraid, and refused to make its fear known even if it existed. An enemy whose silence after every strike was more demoralizing than any retaliation could have been, because silence gave the insurgents nothing to rally their own fighters against. He said, in words later paraphrased across several unclassified summaries, that his commanders could inspire men to die fighting soldiers who shot back. They could not inspire men to keep fighting an enemy who simply, quietly, made people disappear, and never explained why. That distinction, between an enemy that terrifies through spectacle, and one that terrifies through precision and silence, became the through line of everything Abu Yusuf offered in the months that followed. He described watching morale inside his own network collapse, not after a major battle, but after a string of quiet disappearances that left no bodies, no martyrs, no footage for propaganda, nothing his commanders could turn into recruitment material. A fighter who dies in an airstrike becomes a symbol. A fighter who simply vanishes overnight, whose fate is never confirmed, becomes a rumor. And rumors, Abu Yusuf said, corrode an insurgency from within far more effectively than casualties ever could. Several other detainees captured in the same period, interrogated separately and without knowledge of each other's statements, described almost identical psychological effects, a detail interrogators flagged specifically because independent corroboration across unconnected sources is rare and considered highly reliable in intelligence analysis. One of those separate accounts, from a fighter captured near Habania, roughly 5 months after Abu Yusuf, described the same units in strikingly similar language, without ever having met him or having access to his file. He told interrogators that the fighters under his command had started referring to certain nights as belonging to the quiet ones, nights when patrols would simply not return to base and no message would ever explain why. He said fear of open combat had never significantly reduced recruitment in his area. Fear of the quiet ones did, because open combat offered the chance of glory, and the quiet ones offered nothing but an ending nobody would ever hear about. A third detainee, a former mid-level financier interrogated in a separate facility entirely, used almost the same phrase independently, describing the same units simply as the ones who do not knock twice, a reference to the fact that by the time anyone realized what was happening, the operation was already concluding rather than beginning. What makes these accounts historically significant is not simply that they confirm the operational skill of American Special Operations Forces, something already well documented in military histories and government reports. It is that they offer something those official records almost never capture, the view from the other side of the door, the internal, human cost that a campaign of precise, restrained, overwhelmingly professional violence inflicted on an organization that had built its entire recruiting strategy around visible brutality and visible defiance. Zarqawi's movement thrived on spectacle. It could not survive being answered with silence, and the men interrogators spoke with in those years were, in effect, describing their own organization's slow psychological unraveling in real time, without fully realizing that was what they were doing. The broader legacy of this period extends well beyond Anbar Province, and well beyond the individual testimonies gathered there. The intelligence fusion model refined, during these years, the marriage of real-time surveillance, rapid analysis, and small unit direct action, would go on to define the operation that killed Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad in May of 2011, an operation built on precisely the same principles Abu Yusuf had unknowingly described 5 years earlier, from the inside of a collapsing network. The techniques, the training pipelines, the interagency cooperation, all of it traced back through the same painstaking, largely unglamorous process of turning captured couriers, seized laptops, and patient interrogation into actionable intelligence, night after night, safe house after safe house, until an entire regional insurgency found itself unable to trust its own communications, its own safe houses, or, eventually, its own commanders. And yet almost none of this reached the public in any coherent form. The dominant narrative of the American war on terror, shaped by news cycles built around casualties, controversies, and large-scale military campaigns, had little room for a story built on restraint, on quiet professionalism, and on the internal collapse of an enemy organization, rather than its dramatic, visible defeat. The men who conducted these operations rarely spoke publicly, by design and by regulation. The men who could have described the effect from the inside were for years sitting in detention facilities, their statements filed away in reports that few outside the intelligence community would ever read. Abu Yusuf himself was eventually released in a later prisoner transfer, his subsequent fate undocumented in any public record, his name never widely known, his testimony surviving only as a handful of paraphrased lines, buried inside academic studies of insurgent morale. What remains, then, is not a triumphant story in the traditional sense, no flag raised, no single decisive battle, no cinematic final confrontation. What remains is something quieter, and in its own way, more remarkable, a documented pattern, corroborated independently by multiple captured members of the same network, describing an American fighting force that dismantled an entrenched insurgency, not primarily through firepower, but through discipline, intelligence, and a refusal to grant its enemy the spectacle it needed to survive. The man in that schoolhouse outside Ramadi, sleepless and afraid not of death but of silence, understood something about that fight more clearly than most of the historians who would later try to explain it. He understood that the most dangerous enemy is not the one who announces his arrival. It is the one who arrives, finishes, and disappears again into the dark, leaving nothing behind but the question of who might be next.